Hey students, Friday here. It is time for us to start putting everything together that we've learned up until this point with dinner plate number 2. At this point, you should have a solid understanding of how the surface of the Earth can change and how moving liquid magma under the surface can drive those changes. What evidence have we collected from earthquakes that matches what we know about plate boundaries, and how deep have humans actually drilled? What would it be like to travel deep down into the earth? That's a question that a lot of students have, and it's a great question. Miners have actually asked this question for a long time and have made some practical choices to solve this question. And there are three big problems that we have encountered that prevent us from drilling down into the crust of the earth. And those problems are, first of all, it gets hot the farther you get into the earth and the closer you get towards the core. To the tune of just drilling down just a few miles, it can get into the hundreds of degrees Fahrenheit. And that's not something that we would be able to survive. Also, as you go farther down in the earth, there is a lack of breathable oxygen, so that if you've ever seen the movie Journey to the Center of the Earth, that's fun science fiction for us to consider, but the reality is that there would not be breathable oxygen down there. In fact, what you would most likely encounter, that miners are famous for carrying canaries down with them into mines, because if they're poison gases, they are often, they don't have a smell, they're odorless, and so miners would carry canaries down with them, and those canaries would essentially die off and would be a sacrifice that would let the miner know that there are potentially poisonous gases down there. Now, that doesn't mean that we haven't tried. The current record for human drilling is 7.62 miles into the crust of the earth, or about 12.26 kilometers. That deepest hole that has been drilled was done in Russia, and that record has not been surpassed. That was through continental crust, and if you think back to earlier questions that we've asked in prior videos or in different experiences that you've had with the plate tectonics unit, the average thickness of continental crust can be anywhere from 25 to 35 miles thick. So 7.62 miles, that's not drilling very far into the crust. Now, ocean crust is thinner, and that's why I want to tell you about a project that is being developed in Japan to drill into that thinner ocean crust so that we can get a better understanding of what is happening down there. And so here's the project. This project is being conducted by JAMSTEC, and JAMSTEC is short for Japan's Agency for Marine Earth Science Technology. And Japan is bankrolling this project, and basically what they want to do, and they have a goal to do this by 2030, so a little ways into the future, we're talking 12 years or so into the future. They have a boat called the Chiku, and I will show you a picture of that boat here shortly. And what they're going to do is they're going to drill, well, you don't have to drill through water. They're going to lower the drill 4 kilometers down to the base of the ocean. Most of the sites that they are selecting are in the Pacific Ocean. Then they get to the ocean floor where the crust is significantly thinner. They're targeting parts of the ocean floor that are the thinnest, like maybe only 6 kilometers or about 4 miles or so deep, and one of their many goals is to drill into the mantle of the earth where the rock is semi-molten, it kind of flows, it's like a plasticky sort of flowing, and they're wanting to investigate a lot of really interesting questions. First of all, what forms ocean crust? We think we have an idea about that from what we've studied at divergent plate boundaries. Divergent plate boundaries being, of course, where crust solidifies and is created, and then, of course, crust is destroyed at convergent plate boundaries. And another big goal they have is to determine how deep in Earth's crust does life actually exist. And so they're going to take microbial samples at these locations to try to determine how deep this life on Earth is within the crust. Here's a picture of the boat. Okay, it's called the Shikyu, and you can see that there's the JAMSTEC logo on there showing that this is a Japanese boat. And so here's the drilling rig in which they're going to put this long pipe down to try to finally get humans drilling into the mantle. And so that's an example of a project that humans are working on and will be working on over the next decade or so to try to actually drill into the Earth's crust. Now, what else can we know about what's going on the surface from other measurement means? Well, this is called the Ring of Fire, this area around the Pacific Ocean where there are a lot of plate boundaries. And so this red line that is overlapping these black lines that are running across the Pacific Ocean. This is called the Ring of Fire, and this is where a lot of volcanoes on Earth's surface are concentrated. This is not the only place where there are volcanoes, but where a large amount of volcanoes are located, because most of these boundaries are where most convergent plate boundaries on the surface of the Earth is. In the Atlantic Ocean, there's a large divergent boundary. There's a divergent boundary here in the Indian Ocean, as well as in the South Pacific, where a crust is splitting away from itself, and a lot of that crust is converging along the Ring of Fire, where the Pacific and Nazca and Cocoa plates are located. When we map earthquakes all over the world, we notice that there are patterns with those earthquakes. Scientists are not just saying, oh, there are earthquakes on the surface of the Earth that could hurt. There are earthquakes on the surface of the Earth that could hurt humans. They're also saying, what are the characteristics of these earthquakes? Where are they occurring? Well, it probably shouldn't surprise us that earthquakes on the surface of the Earth are happening where the crust is actually interacting with itself. So all of these lines of yellow dots or orange dots or red dots are data points for where earthquakes are occurring. And these earthquake patterns follow where these dark lines are on this prior diagram. In other words, the majority of earthquakes on the surface of the Earth, if we focus just on the coast of North America here, where the San Andreas Fault is located, a transformed plate boundary, watch what happens when we switch to the next image. Boom! Tons of earthquakes in California. This probably shouldn't surprise you. You've heard news stories of earthquakes in California. Some of you may have lived in or around or visited California when there was an earthquake happening. And so earthquakes can happen anywhere on the surface of the Earth, but they are more likely to happen where there are plate boundaries. And by studying the patterns of where these earthquakes are located, we can predict and know where convergent, divergent, and transformed plate boundaries are. Now, this is not the only piece of evidence that we rely upon. This is just an additional piece of evidence that is contributing to this grand theory of plate tectonics. Remember, a theory in science is a big deal. A theory in science means that we have collected a tremendous amount of different forms of evidence that give us a clear picture of how things are working on the Earth. So not only do we have satellites that are measuring the movements of continents and showing which continents are moving together and which continents are separating apart from each other, but we can also use earthquake patterns as another piece of evidence to help us to understand what is going on. Notice how the red dots and the orange dots are mostly concentrated in certain areas on the surface. Just to orient you on this document, the white is land. So here's North America. Here's about where Nebraska is. This is South America. This is Asia and Africa. And here we have Australia and Pacific Ocean in gray in the center. The Atlantic Ocean in gray over here. So in looking at this diagram, notice how most of the red and orange dots are concentrated in this ring of fire around this outer edge. And notice how that there's some orange dots happening over here where the Himalayan mountains are located. That is not coincidental. Red and orange dots on this map are signifying really deep earthquakes. Now, why would we have really deep earthquakes at certain places? Well, really deep earthquakes are happening at these convergent boundaries where crust is sinking underneath other crust deep into the mantle of the Earth. Those plates that are sinking underneath are melting, and we have therefore earthquakes that are happening deep underneath the crust of the Earth in the mantle, producing these really deep measurable earthquakes. There's convergent boundaries wherever this is happening. In fact, here's a labeled diagram that shows where a lot of these convergent boundaries are. Notice how the color of the dots are different. Notice that the size of the dots is different as well. On this image, the size of the dot is representing the strength of the earthquake. And so the red and purple and blue dots are really deep earthquakes, and the yellow dots are more shallow earthquakes that are happening near the center. And depending upon the pattern that we see, that can tell us what sort of plate boundaries are located there. So wherever we see these purple and blue and red dots, those are convergent boundaries happening at those locations. Indian plate is moving into the Eurasian plate and pushing up the Himalayan mountains. That's why we have this massive mountain range here in Asia, because we have one plate pushing into another plate, pushing up these mountains because they are both pieces of continental crust. We have an oceanic plate, the Pacific plate, that is sinking underneath the Eurasian plate at Japan, which is why Japan has volcanoes. The same thing is happening with the Philippine Islands and the volcanic islands in the western Pacific Ocean near where the Coral Sea is located. We also have the Nazca plate sinking underneath the South American plate, producing volcanoes for the Andes Mountains, a volcanic mountain range. There aren't as many earthquakes, and they are shallow earthquakes wherever we have divergent plate boundaries, like here in the Indian Ocean and in the southern Pacific Ocean, and along where the Atlantic Ocean is located. We have divergent plate boundaries, and then it shouldn't really surprise us that we know we have a transform plate boundary on the western coast of North America, where the San Andreas Fault is located. That is a transform fault that can produce a lot of earthquakes when the plates are shifting past each other. So thanks for watching. Scientists have gotten very creative with measurement techniques to build a strong collection of evidence for crust moving. We will wrap up plate tectonics in large group with a study of the nature of earthquake waves and how that has helped us to understand the inside of the Earth, even though we can't go there. Be sure to answer the questions on the back page, and thanks for watching this video.